The Galactic Council did not believe in monsters. It believed in mathematics. For 11,000 years, the Council had governed the 91 member species of the Concordat with a single instrument, and that instrument was fear. Not the crude, screaming fear of the old empires that had burned themselves out before the Concordat rose. The Council had refined fear into a science. It had catalogued it, weighed it, plotted it on curves, and reduced it to a discipline as precise as orbital mechanics. In the great vaulted archives of the world called Threnod, there were rooms the length of continents devoted entirely to the study of dread, and the scholars who worked in those rooms considered themselves the true rulers of the galaxy. Kings came and went. Fear endured, and the Council held its ledger. The chief instrument of that ledger was the Ministry of Compliance, and the mind that governed the ministry was an old Threndari named Vale Toon. To look at Vale Toon was to look at something built rather than born. The Threndari were a tall, narrow people, their skin the gray of wet slate, their faces long and hairless and unmoved by the ordinary weather of emotion. Vale Toon had ruled the ministry for 600 years, and in those centuries he had watched 100 species be admitted to the Concordat, and he had broken each of them the same way. He had never raised a weapon. He had never needed to. He simply found the precise pressure at which a people would yield, and he applied it, and they yielded, and afterward they thanked him, because that was the genius of the thing. A species that had been taught to fear correctly did not resent its master. It loved him, the way a child loves the parent whose displeasure it dreads. Fear, Vale Toon was fond of saying to his students, is not a feeling. Feeling is what the small creatures have. Fear is a language, and we are its only fluent speakers. Every species that has ever lived has spoken a dialect of it badly without grammar. We alone know the whole tongue. He believed this the way other beings believe in gravity. And on the day the human question came before the Council, he believed it still. The humans had come to the Concordat's attention 40 of their years earlier, when a survey drone drifted into a system that the star charts had listed as empty, and found it full of noise. The little blue world at the center of that noise was crowded with a species that had crawled up out of a single gravity well and flung itself outward with a speed that the Council's analysts found first amusing, and then, gradually, less so. Humanity had no elegant technology. Its ships were welded together out of desperation and stubbornness. Its politics were a shambles. Its history, when the Council finally translated it, read like the record of a species that had spent its entire existence trying to murder itself and failing, for the sole and infuriating reason that it kept surviving things it had no business surviving. The analysts wrote long reports. The reports came at last to the desk of Vale Toon. He read them the way a physician reads a chart, and he came to a conclusion, and the conclusion was this: humanity was an anomaly, and anomalies were dangerous, because they suggested that the ledger might be incomplete. There was, in all the vast archive of dread on Threnod, no clean file for humans. Their fear responses did not fall on the standard curves. They startled easily, which suggested a fragile species, and then they walked directly back into the thing that had startled them, which suggested nothing the Council had a word for. They wept at the death of animals and laughed at the edge of their own graves. They built shrines to their disasters. They told their young the stories of their worst defeats and made those stories beautiful. It was, Vale Toon decided, a species that had not yet been taught the language correctly, so he resolved to teach it. The Concordat did not conquer. That was beneath it, and besides, it was unnecessary. When a new species was found, the Council extended an invitation, and the invitation was, in its politeness, a trap. Join us, it said, and share in the wealth and the peace of 91 worlds. What it did not say, but what every joining species eventually learned, was the price. To join the Concordat, a people surrendered the keys to its own courage. It accepted a compliance officer. It allowed the ministry to install in the heart of its government the quiet machinery of fear, and thereafter it was governed not by force but by the certainty of consequence, and the certainty never had to be demonstrated more than once. The humans were invited, and to negotiate the terms of their joining, the council summoned a human delegation to a neutral station in the deep between stars, a gray drum of a place called Halavith, where the great powers met to sign away the freedom of small ones. It was expected that the humans would send elders. Every species sent elders. Fear settled on the old, the way sediment settled in still water. The old had accumulated it, layer on layer, until they moved slowly and spoke carefully and could be relied upon to choose the safe thing. Vale Toon had negotiated with the elders of 40 species, and he had beaten every one of them, and he looked forward to the human elders with the mild anticipation of a master craftsman handed a new but ordinary material. The humans sent a girl. She was not a girl precisely. The humans reckoned her an adult, and her file gave her age as 24 of their years, which the council's actuaries converted and then rechecked, certain of an error. But to the long-lived eyes of the Threndari, she was scarcely more than a hatchling. Her name was Rell Cavanaugh. She held some junior rank in the human diplomatic service, a title that translated to something like second attaché, which was to say the lowest rung of a small and unimportant ladder. She had been on Halavith for 11 days as an aide to the actual human ambassador, an older woman named Osai, when the incident occurred that changed everything. The incident was this: Ambassador Osai fell ill. It was nothing sinister, or so the humans claimed, a failure of the woman's aging heart, the kind of quiet betrayal that the human body practiced on itself. She was placed in the station's medical bay in a coma from which she would not wake for weeks. And the human delegation, which consisted of the ambassador, her attaché, and 2 functionaries with no authority whatsoever, was suddenly headless on the eve of the most important negotiation in the history of their species. By every protocol the council understood, the humans should have withdrawn. They should have begged for a delay, and the council would have granted it graciously, and the delay would have cost humanity a measure of standing, and the negotiation would have proceeded from a position of human weakness. That was how it always went. Weakness compounded. A species that flinched at the threshold was a species that would sign anything. Instead, the young woman named Rell Cavanaugh sent a message to the council's protocol office, and the message said that she would negotiate in the ambassador's place. The office assumed she meant to request the delay. She did not. She meant to sit down at the table. Vale Toon, when the message was brought to him, felt something he had not felt in a very long time, and it took him a moment to identify it, because it was so unfamiliar in the context of his work. It was curiosity. A junior functionary, a child by any reasonable measure, alone, 10,000 light-years from her homeworld, with no support and no experience and no authority beyond what desperation lent her, proposing to negotiate the fate of her species against the oldest and most refined instrument of fear the galaxy had ever produced. "She does not understand what she is walking into," said the undersecretary, a squat and self-satisfied being named Provost Kell of the Meshach, who served the ministry as its second voice. "No," said Vale Toon, "she does not. That is the interesting part." He set the message down. "Prepare the chamber, and prepare the instruments. Let us give the child a proper education." He did not mean torture. It is important to understand this, because it is the thing that everyone got wrong afterward, in the telling. Vale Toon did not deal in torture. Torture was the tool of the old empires, the ones that had burned out. Torture produced a single crude note where fear was capable of an entire symphony. What Vale Toon meant was the full and formal application of the ministry's art. He meant the chamber itself, which was designed at every level to unmake the confidence of whoever sat in the small chair at its center. He meant the pheromonal fields the Threndari secreted, the ancient chemistry by which his people had once ruled their own hive cities, which raised in the brains of most species a low and inexplicable animal terror, a sense that a predator stood just behind them in the dark. He meant the array of subtle machineries, the light tuned to the frequency of unease, the infrasound below the threshold of hearing that made hearts stumble, the slow theater of implication by which he would show the girl, without ever once threatening her, exactly how small she was, and exactly how large the thing was that she had chosen to defy. He had done it 40 times. It had worked 40 times. He was, in his cold and scholarly way, looking forward to it. The chamber on Halavith was called the Room of Accord, which was a joke, though only the council found it funny. It was a great dim hemisphere, its walls seamless and the color of old ash, and it was built so that a being entering it felt the ceiling pressing down and the floor falling away at once. There was a long, curved table at which the members of the council sat in tiers, raised above the floor, so that anyone addressing them had to look up, as a supplicant looks up. And at the focus of all that architecture, on the bare floor, small and exposed and lit by a light that seemed to come from nowhere and to allow no shadow, there was a single chair. Into that chair on the appointed day walked Rell Cavanaugh. Vale Toon watched her come. He had watched 40 species send their champions across that floor, and he had learned to read the whole story of a negotiation in the walk. The proud ones came in fast and left slow. The frightened ones came in slow and never really left at all. He watched the human girl cross the ash-gray floor, and he found that he could not read her, and that too was novel, and he filed it away. She was small even for a human, which the council understood to be a small species. Her hair was dark and pulled back severely from a face that the council's aesthetic analysts had flagged as young with an emphasis that suggested they meant too young. She wore the plain dark clothing of the human service without ornament, and she carried nothing, no aid, no data slate, no ceremonial token, nothing but herself. She reached the chair. She did not sit. She stood beside it and looked up at the tiers of the council, at the 91 delegates arranged in their glory, at the pheromonal haze already thickening in the air, at the great gray, unreadable face of Vale Toon at the summit of it all. And she waited, and her waiting had a quality that Vale Toon had not encountered before at that table. It was not the paralysis of the terrified. It was not the bravado of the doomed. It was something quieter and far more troubling. She looked, he thought, like a person who had already been somewhere worse than this, and had come back, and had brought the memory of it with her into the room like a stone in her pocket. "Second attaché Cavanaugh," said Provost Kell, and his amplified voice rolled across the chamber. "You come before the Council of the Concordat to speak for your species. Do you understand the gravity of this?" "I do," said the girl. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be, the chamber carried it. But it was steady, and there was in its steadiness the first faint wrongness, the first note in the whole grand instrument of the room that did not resolve the way it should have. A being properly afraid could keep its voice steady, but only by effort, and the effort showed. There was no effort in the girl's voice. There was only the fact of it, laid down flat, like a card placed on a table by someone who had decided some time ago exactly how the hand would end. "You are aware," Kell went on, "that your ambassador is incapacitated, that you speak with no rank sufficient to this table, that whatever you agree here binds your entire species, and that there will be no appeal and no revision and no mercy of a second attempt." "I'm aware," she said. "And you proceed regardless." "I proceed," she said, "because I was sent to." There was a small stir among the tiers at that, a rustle of translated confusion. It was the wrong answer. The expected answers were defiance, or supplication, or the trembling insistence that she had no choice. She had offered none of these. She had offered obedience plainly, as though obedience were a kind of strength, and the council did not at first know what to make of it. Vale Toon made something of it. He leaned forward very slightly, and for the first time he spoke, and his voice was soft. And softness in that chamber was the most frightening thing of all, because everyone in the galaxy knew that when Vale Toon dropped his voice, it meant that the true work had begun. "Sent by whom, child?" he asked. "Your ambassador sleeps. Your government is 100 centuries of travel away. Who in this room sent you?" And the girl looked up at him, at the gray architect of 91 broken worlds, and she did not flinch, and she said, "You'll find out." It was not a threat. That was the thing Vale Toon would turn over in his mind for a long time afterward. It had none of the heat of a threat. It was said the way one states a fact about the weather that has not yet arrived but certainly will. "You'll find out," as though the finding out were already scheduled, already inevitable, already on its way toward them across some distance that only she could see. Vale Toon settled back into his seat. He was 600 years old, and he had heard every kind of bluff, and he told himself that this was one more, the desperate improvisation of a cornered child. He told himself that the pheromones would do their work, that the light and the infrasound and the great pressing weight of the room would strip the flat calm from her voice within the hour, that she would leave the chamber the way they all left it, hollowed out and grateful. He told himself these things, and they were reasonable things, and he had 6 centuries of evidence for every one of them. But somewhere beneath the ledger, in the old animal part of the Threndari brain that even 600 years of discipline had not entirely paved over, something stirred that he had not felt since he was young. It was very small. He would not have called it fear, because he did not permit himself fear, because he was fear's master and its owner and its only fluent speaker. But it was the shape of a question. And the question was, what does a species become when it has already survived the worst thing you could threaten it with, and it knows that, and you do not? He silenced the question. He gave the signal. The great doors of the room of accord sealed with a sound like a held breath, and the negotiation began, and the council settled in to teach the human child the meaning of fear. They would learn, all of them, that they had the pupil and the teacher exactly reversed. The first hour proceeded exactly as Vale Toon had planned, and this was itself the first sign that something was wrong, though he did not recognize it as such until much later. He began, as he always began, with the architecture of consequence. He did not make demands. Making demands invited refusal, and refusal was a form of dignity. And Vale Toon's method was to deny his subjects every avenue to dignity before they even understood that the road had closed behind them. Instead, he described. In his soft, patient, scholarly voice, he described to the human girl the terms of the Concordat as they applied to a new member. And he did it the way a surgeon describes an operation to a patient who has not yet realized that the anesthetic has already been withheld. Humanity, he explained, would be welcomed. Its worlds would be catalogued and its people counted, and its industry integrated into the great tidal economy of the 91. In exchange, humanity would accept a compliance officer, seated permanently at the highest level of its government, with authority to review, and where necessary, to correct any human policy that the ministry judged discordant. Humanity would surrender the manufacture of certain classes of weapon. Humanity would submit its young to the standard developmental screenings, by which the ministry identified and gently redirected those individuals whose temperament ran toward the discordant. Humanity would, in short, become a good citizen of the galaxy, and in return it would never again have to be afraid of anything, because the council would do all of its fearing for it, and would tell it precisely and reliably what to be afraid of, and when. "You are offering to own us," said Rell Cavanaugh. "We are offering to protect you," said Vale Toon. "The distinction is one that the young often struggle with. In time, you will come to understand that they are the same thing." He watched her as he said it. He had, by now, engaged the full apparatus of the chamber. The pheromonal field had thickened to a concentration that in most species produced a persistent, unplaceable dread, a conviction that something terrible was about to happen, and that one was helpless to prevent it. The infrasound was working beneath the floor, at frequencies that made the chest tighten and the animal mind whisper of avalanche and predator and the collapse of high places. The light had shifted by degrees no conscious eye could track, cooling toward the spectrum that the ministry's research had identified as maximally unsettling to bilaterally symmetrical vertebrates. 40 species had sat in that chair under that assault, and Rell Cavanaugh had watched their hands begin to tremble, their eyes begin to dart, their voices begin to climb toward the register of panic. The human girl's hands were still, her eyes were steady, her voice when she answered had not moved so much as a semitone. This was not, in itself, unprecedented. Discipline could hold a body still for a time even as the mind screamed. What was unprecedented was the quality of the stillness. Rell Cavanaugh had made a lifelong study of the difference between the calm of the disciplined and the calm of the genuinely unafraid, and he prided himself that he could tell them apart at a glance, the way a jeweler tells the true stone from the paste. The disciplined calm was a lid held down over a boiling pot. You could see, always, the strain at the edges, the flicker of the thing being suppressed. The girl's calm had no edges. There was no boiling pot beneath it. When he searched her face for the strain of suppression, he found only a tension. She was listening to him. She was, he realized with a slow and creeping discomfort, studying him, the way he was studying her, and she was doing it without the smallest tax of terror to distract her. He decided to escalate. "Let me speak plainly," he said, "since you value plainness. You have come here alone. Your ambassador will not wake in time to help you. Your species does not know what is happening in this room, and by the time it learns, the terms will be signed. You have no allies at this table. Every delegate you see has already submitted to the Concordat, and every one of them submitted here in this chamber, in that chair. You are the 92nd, and you are the youngest and the least prepared of any who ever sat where you sit. I tell you these things not to frighten you." He paused, and let the lie hang, gleaming in the cold air. "I tell you so that you will understand there is no version of this in which you leave this room having won. There is only the version in which you sign willingly and are honored for your wisdom, and the version in which you resist and are broken and sign anyway and are pitied. Choose the first. It is kinder." It was the speech he gave in some form to all of them, the speech that closed the last door, and he had never known it to fail. He watched for the collapse. He watched for the moment, familiar as sunrise, when the subject understood at last that there was no way out and the will went slack, and the terms could be poured into the emptied vessel. Rell Cavanaugh tilted her head, a small human gesture, and said, "You keep saying this room." Rell Cavanaugh waited. "You keep telling me what happens in this room," she said. "In that chair, at this table. You've done this 91 times, and every time it happened here in a room like this with a chair like this and you at the top of it looking down." She looked up at him, and there was something almost gentle in her face, something that in another context he might have called pity. "You built a machine for this room. The smell, the sound, the light. I can feel it. It's very good. It's the best I've ever felt." A pause. "But you have never once in 11,000 years had to leave the room, have you?" "I do not take your meaning," said Rell Cavanaugh, though the cold thing beneath the ledger had begun, very quietly, to move. "I mean," said the girl, "that fear is easy when you own the room. Anybody can be brave sitting at the top of the table. I'm asking what you are when the table's gone." Provost Kell made a sound of contempt, amplified into the chamber. "The child threatens the council," he said. "How quaint. Attaché, you sit alone on a station the council controls, 10,000 light years from your kind. There is no table but ours. There will be no other." "I know," said Rell Cavanaugh. "That's what I said. You've never had to leave." And she smiled very slightly, and the smile was the worst thing yet, because it was not a brave smile and it was not a mad smile. It was a patient one. Rell Cavanaugh had, by this point in his career, developed an instinct that had never once failed him, and the instinct now was speaking to him clearly, and what it said was, "Something is wrong with this negotiation, and the wrongness is not in the child. It is in you, in your certainty, in the ledger, in the room. He did not listen to the instinct. 600 years of unbroken success is a heavy thing, and it sat on the instinct and smothered it, and he pressed on, because he had a script, and the script had never failed, and he believed with the whole weight of his life that it could not fail now. "Enough," he said. "We will proceed to the terms. The council will read them into the accord, and you will assent, article by article, and when the reading is done you will place your mark, and humanity will take its place among the 91. Provost Kell, begin the reading." And Provost Kell began to read, in the flat liturgical drone in which the terms of surrender were always read, and the reading was long, and it was designed to be long, because exhaustion was one of the ministry's oldest tools, and a subject worn down by hours of relentless enumeration signed things that a fresh subject might have balked at. The articles unrolled: the surrender of weapons, the submission of the young, the seating of the compliance officer, the forfeiture of certain rights of assembly, certain freedoms of movement between the stars, certain liberties of speech that the council had learned, through long practice, were the seeds from which discord grew. Article after article, each one a small amputation, each one read in the same gray, unhurried voice, and the pheromones thick in the air and the infrasound grinding beneath the floor and the light gone cold as the between stars dark. And through all of it the girl watched Vale tune. She did not watch Kell, who was reading. She did not watch the terms scroll up the great display for the record. She watched the old Threndari at the summit of the tiers steadily, without hostility and without fear, and there was something in the watching that began, as the hours passed, to work on Vale Toon in a way he could not name and did not like. He was accustomed to being the observer. It was the fixed law of his universe. He watched, and others were watched, and the difference between the two was the whole difference between the ruler and the ruled. To be watched calmly by the small creature at the bottom of the room, hour upon hour, while she showed no fear and he could not stop showing that he had noticed she showed none. It was a reversal so quiet and so total that it took him a long time even to perceive it, and by the time he perceived it, it had already changed the temperature of the room. Kell finished the reading. The last article fell into the silence. The display held the whole terrible document, 91 articles, the standard instrument by which a species was made a subject. "The reading is complete," said Kell. "Attaché Cavanaugh, do you assent?" Rell Cavanaugh was quiet for a moment. Then she said no. It was not the no of defiance. That was the thing they kept getting wrong. There was no ringing in it, no lifted chin, no doomed heroism. It was a small, ordinary, almost administrative no, the no of a clerk pointing out that a form has been filled in wrongly. And somehow that made it far more disturbing than any cry of defiance could have been, because defiance the council understood. Defiance was fear turned inside out, and fear was their native tongue. This was not fear inside out. This was something with no fear in it at all, and the council had no file for it, and the not having a file was, Vale Toon realized, beginning to feel like the floor tilting. "You refuse the terms," said Kell, and there was in his voice the first thin thread of something that was not contempt. "I refuse the terms," she agreed. "Then you will be broken," said Kell, "and you will sign them anyway. This too is in the accord. This too has happened 91 times. 91 times, said Rell Cavanaugh. You found the thing they were most afraid of and you showed it to them and they signed. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had come a very long way to confirm. So find it. Go ahead. I'll wait. Find the thing I'm most afraid of and show it to me. And the chamber went very still, because this was not in the script. In 91 negotiations, no subject had ever invited the machinery upon itself. The invitation broke something in the architecture of the room, some load-bearing assumption, and the delegates in their tiers shifted and murmured, and even Provost Kell fell silent, and the only one who did not move was Vale Toon, who sat at the summit of it all and looked down at the small human woman who had just asked him to do his worst, and felt, for the first time in 600 years, the specific and unfamiliar sensation of a trap that he had walked into rather than set. Because he could not decline. The whole authority of the ministry, the whole legitimacy of the ledger, rested on the demonstrated truth that the council could find and break the fear of any living thing. To decline the girl's invitation was to admit, before 91 delegates and the eternal record, that there existed a species whose fear the council could not find. He could not decline. And he could not, he was suddenly and coldly certain, succeed, because a being who invited you to find her deepest fear was a being who had already been to the bottom of that fear and made her peace with the dark down there. And you cannot show a creature the abyss when the creature has already lived in it and climbed back out and learned the way by heart. But he did not know that yet, not fully. He only felt the edge of it, the way one feels the edge of a stair in the dark, the instant before the weight comes down and finds no ground. "Very well," said Vale Toon softly, and his soft voice for the first time in memory cost him an effort to keep soft. "You have asked. The council will answer. Let the record show that the subject requested the full instrument and that the council, in its mercy, grants the request." He raised one long gray hand. "Bring the deep room." And a door opened in the seamless wall that no one had known was a door. And beyond it was a darkness that even the delegates flinched from, and Rell Cavanaugh looked at that darkness, and then she looked back up at Vale Toon, and she said the thing that he would hear afterward in every silence for the rest of his long life. She said, "You still think this is happening to me?" The deep room was the ministry's masterwork, and Vale Toon had designed it himself. It was not a torture chamber. Vale Toon wished the historians to be very clear about this, though by the time there were historians it no longer mattered what he wished. There were no instruments in the deep room in the crude sense, no blades, no fire, nothing that left a mark on the body. The deep room worked on the mind, and it worked by a principle that Vale Toon considered the highest achievement of his people's long study of dread. It did not show its subject anything. It showed the subject nothing, and let the subject's own fear paint the nothing in. It was a sphere of perfect black, perfect silence, and perfect isolation. When the door sealed, the occupant floated in a warm suspension medium at exactly blood temperature, so that after a few minutes the body lost track of where it ended and the world began. There was no light. There was no sound but the sound of one's own heart and breath, magnified by the silence into something monstrous. There was no up and no down, no time, no touch, no proof of one's own continued existence except the frantic testimony of a mind left alone with itself in the dark. Every species the ministry had ever tested broke in the deep room, and they broke faster than anywhere else, because the deep room did not fight them. It simply took away everything that was not their own fear, and then it let their own fear do the work. The record for endurance, across 91 species and 11,000 years, was 4 hours. After 4 hours, the strongest mind the galaxy had ever produced had begun to scream, and had not stopped. They put Rell Cavanaugh into the deep room, and Vale Toon set the observation feed to run into the room of accord, so that the delegates could witness, and he settled back to wait, and he told himself that this, at last, was the ground that did not tilt. For the first hour, nothing happened. This was expected. The mind took time to understand where it was, time for the silence to grow teeth. Vale Toon watched the biometric readouts, the heart rate, the respiration, the fine electrical weather of the brain, and he saw them settle rather than climb, and he told himself that the settling was the false calm before the fall, the deep breath the body takes before the plunge. He had seen it many times. He waited for the plunge. In the second hour, Rell Cavanaugh began to speak. There was a channel in the deep room, a one-way channel, by which the subject's voice could be heard in the room of accord, but by which no sound could reach the subject. It existed so that the council could record the confessions, the pleadings, the incoherent surrenders that the deep room reliably produced. Vale Toon had heard 10,000 hours of that channel over his career, and it was always, without exception, the sound of a mind coming apart. The human girl's voice, when it came, was calm. "I know you can hear me," she said into the dark to the council she could not see. "I know you can't answer. That's all right. I didn't come here to be answered. I came here to tell you a story, and this is a good place for it because you built this room to make me listen to myself, and I'm going to make you listen to me instead." Vale Toon stared at the readouts. The heart rate was steady. The brain's electrical weather was calm, almost meditative, the pattern of a mind that has found a task and set itself to it. "When I was 9 years old," said Rell Cavanaugh, floating in the perfect dark, "the colony I lived on died." She said it simply, the way she said everything. It was called Meridian. It was the first world humans ever settled outside our home system, and it was supposed to be the proof that we could do it, that we could live somewhere the universe hadn't made for us. 11,000 people. My mother and father were terraforming engineers. They went to make the air breathable for the ones who'd come after. And for 8 years it worked, and I was born there, under a sky that human hands had made blue, and I thought that was just how the world was. I thought the sky was something people made. The delegates in their tiers had gone silent. The pheromonal haze hung in the air, unnoticed now. On the observation feed, the black sphere held its single small human shape, and the calm voice went on. "In my 9th year, the atmosphere plant failed. Not all at once. That's the part I want you to understand because I think it's the part your kind has never learned. It failed slowly, over 11 days. And everyone on Meridian knew from the first day that it could not be fixed and that they were going to die and that there was no ship coming because the nearest ship was 40 days away and we had 11. 11 days. We knew. All 11,000 of us knew, the whole time, exactly what was coming and exactly when." Vale Toon found that he had stopped breathing. He did not know when he had stopped. "You'd think," said Rell Cavanaugh, "that people who knew that would do what you say people do. You'd think they'd break. You've built your whole galaxy on the idea that a creature who knows the worst is coming and can't stop it and has no hope will come apart. That's your whole science, isn't it? That's the ledger. That's the room I'm floating in right now." A pause in the dark. "I was there. I watched 11,000 people find out they were going to die slowly, with time to think about it. And I want to tell you what they actually did." She let the silence hold for a moment. Even the deep room silence seemed to be listening. "They finished things," she said. "My father spent the last 4 days teaching me to read the old way off paper, because he'd always meant to and never had the time, and suddenly he had nothing but time. My mother recorded 11 days of messages for a daughter she knew she wouldn't see grow up, one for every birthday she'd miss, and she laughed in most of them, because she said she didn't want me to remember her afraid. The people on Meridian planted gardens they'd never see bloom. They got married. They forgave each other things 30 years old. They put the children on the one shuttle that could reach orbit, 40 of us. All the children and the adults who flew us up came back down, because there wasn't air for them where we were going and they wouldn't take a breath a child could use. They came back down to a world they knew was killing them so that we could have the air." Her voice did not break. That was the terrible thing. It did not break once. "And on the 11th day, when the air ran out, my mother's last message said, 'Do not be afraid of dying, Rell, because everyone does it, and it's the one thing in the whole universe that you never have to do alone. And do not be afraid of living either, because that's the harder one and it's the one I need you to do for both of us.'" In the room of accord, no one moved. "I'm 24 years old," said Rell Cavanaugh, into the dark that Vale Toon had built to unmake her. "I have been to the bottom of the thing you're trying to show me. I went there when I was 9 and I have lived there every day since, and I have made my peace with the dark down here because I grew up in it. You cannot show me the abyss. I was raised in the abyss. My mother sang me to sleep in it. This room, this beautiful room you built to break the bravest minds in the galaxy in 4 hours, this is the closest thing to home I have felt since I was 9 years old, and I could stay in it for the rest of my life." The heart rate on the readout was slow and even. The brain's weather was calm. 2 hours had passed and the human girl in the deep room was not breaking. She was, impossibly, at rest. And Vale Toon understood, at last and all at once, the shape of the thing he had walked into, and the understanding came up through him like cold water rising in a sealed room. The whole edifice of the council, the whole authority of the ministry, the whole 11,000-year reign of the ledger, rested on a single unstated premise, so deep that no one had ever thought to say it aloud, because to say it would have been like saying that water is wet. The premise was this: that every living thing, shown clearly enough the worst that could happen to it, would do anything to avoid it. That was the foundation. That was the bedrock beneath the whole galaxy. Fear worked because avoidance worked, because the threat of the terrible thing could steer a creature the way a bit steers a beast, because at the bottom of every mind was a small animal that wanted, above all else, not to suffer and not to die. And here was a species in which that premise did not hold, not because humans did not fear. Vale Toon saw now with awful clarity that humans feared more than any species he had ever studied. They feared vividly, constantly, with an imagination for catastrophe that dwarfed anything in the ledger. But they had done something with the fear that no other species had done. They had turned and faced it. They had walked their children up to the edge of the abyss and named its parts and told stories about it and made it beautiful, and in doing so they had taken away the one thing that made fear into a leash. They had taken away avoidance. A human who had already decided to endure the worst thing could not be steered by the threat of it, and a creature that could not be steered by fear was, to the council, not a subject at all. It was a solvent. It was the one thing 11,000 years of careful architecture had no defense against, because the architecture had never imagined it could exist. "Bring her out," said Vale Toon. Provost Kell turned to him, and his blunt face was slack with confusion. "The instrument is not complete. The subject has not." "Bring her out," said Vale Toon, and this time his voice was not soft, and the not softness rang through the room of a chord like a cracked bell, because in 600 years the delegates had never heard the master of fear raise his voice, and they understood, without knowing why, that something at the top of the world had shifted. "Bring her out now before he stopped. He had been about to say, before she teaches the others. He did not finish it. But the thought completed itself in the cold, rising water of his mind, and it was this: the observation feed. The delegates, 91 subject species, seated in their tiers, watching a human being given the worst the council could offer and answering it with a story about her mother's lullaby. 91 species who had each sat in that chair, and broken and signed, and spent their lives believing that breaking was the only possible answer, because no one had ever shown them another one. They were being shown another one, right now. And Vale Toon, who had spent 600 years ensuring that no subject ever witnessed another's courage, had, with his own hand, set the feed to run into the chamber, so that the whole council could witness the human girl's education. He had thought he was teaching a lesson. He looked out at the tiers, at the 91 faces turned toward the black sphere and the calm voice, at the terrible dawning stillness on those faces, and he realized that a lesson was indeed being taught in the room of accord, and that he had arranged the whole classroom himself, and that he was not the teacher. "You'll find out," she had said, and he had. The great doors of the deep room began to cycle open, and on the observation feed, before the medium had even finished draining, before the door was fully wide, the calm voice of Rell Cavanaugh spoke once more into the dark, and though she was speaking to the council, every subject species in the tiers heard it, and each one felt it land somewhere it had spent 11,000 years being taught not to feel. "You wanted to teach me fear," she said. "All right, I've been very patient. Now it's my turn to teach you." They brought her back to the chair at the center of the ash-gray floor, and she stood beside it as she had before, dripping the warm medium of the deep room onto the seamless dark, her dark hair plastered to her skull, small and soaked and steady, and she looked up at the tiers of the council, and the tiers of the council looked down at her, and something had changed in the weight of the looking. 2 hours earlier she had looked up at them the way a supplicant looks up at a court. Now the court was leaning forward, and it was the court that seemed to be waiting. Vale Toon made himself speak first, because to let her speak first would have been to concede the room entirely, and he was not yet ready to concede the room, though a part of him already knew that the room had been conceded the moment the deep room's door had opened, and she had walked out of it whole. "You are theatrical," he said, and he was pleased to find that his voice had returned to its softness, though the softness cost him with every word. "You have told a moving story. I do not doubt that it is true. Humans, I am given to understand, have a great gift for making their sorrows into performances. But sentiment is not strength, child. A tragedy in your childhood does not change the arithmetic of this table. You are still alone. You are still 10,000 light years from anything that could help you. And humanity still stands before this council with two choices, to join or to be broken, and you have shown me only that you personally are difficult to break. Very well. You are difficult to break. There are other humans. We have a great deal of time and a very large ledger, and eventually we will find the ones who break easily, and we will let them teach the rest what it costs to be difficult." It was a good speech. It was, in fact, the correct speech, the one that reasserted the arithmetic and reminded the room that a single unbreakable individual did not overturn the mathematics of a species. Under ordinary circumstances it would have worked. Vale Toon had used it like a dozen times, on the rare stubborn champion whose species had, nonetheless, plenty of ordinary members to be leveraged. Rell Cavanaugh listened to it with her head slightly tilted, and when he had finished she said, "You still don't understand what happened in there. You think I told that story to you." She almost smiled. "There's a one-way channel in your deep room. It carries the subject's voice out to this chamber so you can record us breaking. You've used it 10,000 times. It never once occurred to you that a subject might use it on purpose. That a subject might get herself put in the worst room you have, specifically because it's the only room in this station that broadcasts straight into the ears of every species you've ever conquered." Vale Toon went very still. "You gave me a channel to the whole Concordat," she said, "and you sealed the door so no one could interrupt me, and you turned the volume up, and then you asked me to talk. I've been talking to them the whole time." She lifted her chin, not in defiance, but to take in the tiers, the 91, the delegates of every world the council had ever broken. "Hello," she said to them gently. "I know most of you sat in this chair once. I know what you signed. I'm not here to blame you for signing. I'm here to tell you something nobody ever told you before you signed, which is that there was another way to answer, and you never got to see it because he made sure of that." She nodded up toward Vale Toon. "That's the real machine, not the smell or the light or the black room. The real machine is that he keeps you from ever watching each other be brave. Fear only works in the dark, so I made him turn on the lights." The silence in the room of accord had changed its texture entirely. It was no longer the silence of a court awaiting a verdict. It was the silence of 91 peoples who had just been handed, all at once, a thing they had each been separately certain did not exist, the evidence that the room could be survived. And Vale Toon, at the summit of it all, felt the cold water reach his heart because he saw the shape of the whole thing now, saw it entire, and it was worse than he had let himself imagine. The illness of the human ambassador, the girl's insistence on taking the chair alone, her flat calm, her invitation to be broken, her request for the full instrument. Every step of it, which he had read as the flailing of a cornered child, had been a move, placed with a patience and a nerve that he, the master of the ledger, had not detected until every piece was already on the board. "The ambassador," he said slowly, "Osai, her illness was real," said Rell Cavanaugh. "She's really sick. She's really in your medical bay. She really might not wake up." A pause. "She's also 71 years old, and she volunteered for a heart condition she could have had corrected years ago, because we needed someone the council would leave alone in the medical bay, awake enough to talk to your systems, and too frail to be seen as a threat." Her eyes did not waver. We planned this for 9 years, since the first survey drone found us. We knew what you were the moment we read your Concordat, because we'd been you, a long time ago on a small scale on one planet, and we knew exactly how it ends, because we'd already lived through the end of it, and we decided we would not sign your terms and we would not fight your fleets because you'd win the fleets. So we did the third thing. We got one human into that chair alone in front of everyone and we made you do your worst on camera. She spread her soaked hands. I'm the worst you've got, aren't I? The deep room. 4 hours is the record. And here I am. Dry story, wet clothes, still standing, in front of all of them. Provost Kell surged to his feet and his voice cracked as it rolled out. This is sedition. This is the feed, cut the observation feed now. Too late for that, said Rell Cavanaugh, almost kindly. You cut it now. After all of them just watched me walk out of that room, and every single one of them will spend the rest of their lives wondering what you didn't want them to hear next. You can't unfrighten them by turning off the light. That's not how it works. I know that's not how it works. We spent a very long time learning how it works. She looked up at Vale Toon. You did too. You just learned the wrong half. Explain, said Vale Toon. He did not want to say it. The word came out of him against the whole weight of 600 years because the scholar in him, the part that had first been drawn to the study of fear out of a genuine and terrible fascination, needed to hear it even now, even as the water closed over his head. You said I learned the wrong half. Explain what I failed to learn. And Rell Cavanaugh, the second attaché, 24 years old, 10,000 light years from a world with a sky that human hands had made blue, looked up at the oldest and most refined instrument of fear the galaxy had ever produced, and she taught the class he had convened. You learned that fear makes creatures obey, she said. That's true. It does. You built a galaxy on it and the galaxy held for 11,000 years, so you're not wrong. But you only ever studied fear from the top of the table. You studied what fear does to the ones underneath it. You never once studied what fear does to the ones who stop being underneath it, because you made very sure that never happened, because the one time it happened you'd lose everything. So there's a whole half of the science you never got to see. She took a breath. Fear that you run from makes you a slave. That half you know. But fear that you turn and walk into changes into something else on the way. It doesn't disappear. We're still afraid, all of us, all the time. But when you stop running, the fear stops being a leash and starts being a fuel. And a creature running on its own fear, instead of away from it, is the most dangerous thing in the universe, because there's no threat left you can make it. You can't steer it with the thing it's already carrying. My mother knew she was going to die, and she used the fear to record 11 birthdays. My father used it to teach me to read. 11,000 people used it to put their children on a shuttle and walk back down to die in the open air. That's what fear is for. Not obeying. Enduring. And you, she said, and for the first time her voice carried an edge not of hatred, but of something colder and more absolute, a kind of pity that had teeth. You have spent 11,000 years teaching 91 species to run from the exact thing that would have set them free. You didn't rule the galaxy with fear. You robbed it. You found the strongest thing every species had, and you taught them to be ashamed of it. No one spoke. The pheromonal haze had thinned in the air, and no one had ordered it thinned. The ministry's technicians, watching from their alcoves, had simply, quietly stopped feeding the machine, because they too were listening, and a technician listening is a technician not working. Here's what happens now, said Rell Cavanaugh. You're not going to break humanity, because you can't, because we've already been broken on Meridian, on old Earth, on 100 worlds, and in 1,000 years of history, you never bothered to read past the parts where we killed each other. We are a species that is made out of the things that were supposed to end us. Every one of us walking around is the descendant of somebody who survived something that should have been the end. That's not a threat. It's just what we are. So you have 2 choices now, and I'll lay them out plainly because I know you value plainness. She counted them on wet fingers. 1. You let humanity join the Concordat as an equal, no compliance officer, no surrendered weapons, no screening of our children, a real seat at a real table, and in exchange we don't say another word about what happened in this room. Or, 2. You refuse, and I keep talking, and every day for the rest of your reign, every species in these tiers remembers that they watched a human walk out of the deep room and teach the council to be afraid. And they start to wonder what else the room can't do. And they start to wonder it out loud to each other in the dark, where you can't hear them. And fear, Minister, once it changes direction, does not change back. She let the choice sit in the cold air. And then she said the thing that Vale Toon had been dreading since the door of the deep room had first opened. The thing that turned the entire architecture of his world inside out and left it hanging, exposed, in the light he had been forced to switch on. You spent 11,000 years making the galaxy afraid of you, she said. You never once stopped to ask what would happen the day it stopped. You'd better hope humanity joins your Concordat, Minister. Because we're the only thing standing between you and 91 species who just realized, all at once together, watching, that the room can be survived. We know what to do with that fear. We've had practice. She spread her hands a final time, soaked and small and utterly unafraid. They don't, yet. Vale Toon did the thing that the ledger demanded, because 600 years of the ledger do not release their hold in a single hour, no matter what the mind has understood. He reached for the last tool, the one at the very bottom of the ministry's long box, the one that was never used because it was never needed, because the whole point of fear was that you never had to spend it. You have miscalculated one thing, he said, and his soft voice had gone flat and gray as the walls. You have assumed that the council will not simply end you. You stand alone in a chamber we control, on a station we own, in a region of space where your species has no reach. If your death is inconvenient, it is not impossible. We have never had to kill a subject. We have always found it unnecessary. But necessity, child, is a thing you have taught us to reconsider. He let one long gray hand rise. You have shown 91 species that the room can be survived. Very well. I will show them that the human who survived it did not survive this table. I will show them what happens to the ones who make me switch on the lights. Guardians. Figures moved at the edges of the chamber, tall armored shapes, the council's own instruments of last resort, and they came out onto the ash-gray floor and took their positions around the small soaked figure of Rell Cavanaugh, and the whole of the room of accord held its breath. Because this had never happened. In 11,000 years this had never once happened. The master of fear calling for the death of a subject in open chamber. Rell Cavanaugh looked at the Guardians. She looked at their weapons, and then she looked back up at Vale Toon and she laughed. It was not a large laugh. It was tired and it was real, and it was the single most frightening sound that had ever been heard in the room of accord, more frightening than any scream, because a scream was fear and fear the council understood. But this was a young woman looking at her own execution and finding it genuinely a little funny. There it is, she said. That's the tell. That's the thing I came 10,000 light years to see. She shook the water from her eyes. You just reached for the one card you swore you'd never have to play. 11,000 years and you never killed a subject in this chamber, because killing is what you do when fear stops working, and you were so proud that fear never stopped working. And here you are, first hour of the first day of the rest of your life. Reaching for the gun. She spread her hands to take in the Guardians, the weapons, the whole grim tableau. You want to know the difference between us, Minister. You just showed everyone in this room that you're afraid. You, the one who owns fear. You got scared of a wet 24-year-old with no weapon and no allies and a story about her mother. And you got so scared that you did the one thing you spent 11,000 years being too proud to do. And every single delegate in these tiers just watched you do it. Kill her, said Provost Kell, but his voice had gone thin. If you kill me, said Rell Cavanaugh, not to Kell but to Vale Toon steadily, you don't end this. You finish it. Right now watching they're afraid of you. Old fear, habit fear, the fear of the top of the table. But if you kill the human who walked out of your worst room, you don't give them their fear back. You give them a martyr and a memory, and you send 91 species home tonight with the certain knowledge that the Council murders the ones it can't break, in the open, in the chamber, in front of everyone. You've studied fear your whole life. You tell me, what happens to an empire the day its subjects stop being afraid to die and start being afraid of what they'll become if they keep kneeling? She held his gaze. You already know. You've read the histories of the old empires that burned out. That's exactly how every one of them ended, not when the subjects got stronger. When they stopped running. And Vale Toon, hand still raised, guardian still poised, looked out across the tiers of the room of accord, and he made himself see what he had spent the whole terrible afternoon refusing to see. They were watching him, all 91, not her, him. For 600 years in this chamber and its like, every eye had turned to the subject in the chair. That was the geometry of the room, the whole point of the architecture, the reason for the tiers and the light and the small exposed floor, so that all attention flowed downward onto the one being unmade and away from the master doing the unmaking. It was the deepest principle of the ledger, deeper even than avoidance. The ruler was never watched. The ruler was the one who watched. To be looked at was to be a subject. And they were looking at him. 91 peoples, each of whom had once broken in a chair like that one, were leaning forward in their tiers and looking up, past the small human, to the gray figure at the summit, with an expression he had never in 6 centuries seen turned upon himself. And it took him a long moment to name it because he had spent his life on the giving end of it and never the receiving. They were studying him. The way a predator studies a thing it has just realized is not, after all, larger than itself. The way he had studied 40 species across this floor. The way the human girl had studied him from the moment she walked in. The pheromonal haze was gone from the air entirely now. Somewhere in the technicians' alcoves, a being had shut the whole system down, and no one had ordered it, and no one moved to punish it. The infrasound beneath the floor had stilled. The light had warmed. The room of accord, stripped of its instruments, was only a room, a large dim room with a table and a chair, and at the top of the table sat an old man who had just, in front of the entire galaxy, reached for a weapon because a child would not be afraid. A delegate stood. It was in the 3rd tier, one of the 91, a member of a species called the Loom, a quiet folk of the deep-water worlds who had joined the Concordat 900 years before and had never once, in 900 years, spoken in chamber except to assent. The Loom delegate rose from its place slowly, the way a thing rises that has forgotten it is able to, and it did not look at Rell Cavanaugh. It looked at Vale Toon. Minister, it said, and its translated voice trembled not with fear but with the effort of a thing being done for the first time. I sat in that chair 400 years ago. I was young. I signed everything. I have spent 400 years telling my children that there was no other way. It paused and gathered itself, and the whole chamber hung on the pause. I would like to know if that was true. I would like the human to keep talking. I withdraw my objection to the feed. Sit down, said Provost Kell. The Loom delegate did not sit down. In the 5th tier another rose, in the 2nd 2 more, not many. Not a rebellion. There was no shouting, no surge, nothing the guardians could point their weapons at. Just a handful of delegates, here and there across the tiers, standing up in silence, refusing the one thing the Council had always been able to count on, which was that they would stay seated and stay quiet and stay below. Each one that stood made it easier for the next, exactly as Rell Cavanaugh had said, exactly as the human girl had known it would, because she came from a species that had learned, the hard way, on a dying colony under a manufactured sky, that courage is the most contagious thing in the universe, and that the only way to stop it is to make sure no one ever sees it happen. He had made them see it happen. He had sealed the door and turned up the volume and switched on the lights, and he had made 91 species watch it happen. And now it was happening, quietly, standing up, one delegate at a time, and there was not a weapon in the ministry's long box that could make a being sit back down once it had decided, of its own will, to stand. Vale Toon lowered his hand. The guardians looked to him, uncertain. He did not give the order. He looked at the small soaked human at the center of the floor, and at the delegates standing in the tiers, and at the whole grand architecture of dread that he had spent 600 years perfecting, now hanging exposed and useless in the warm and ordinary light, and he understood that he was, at this moment, the most frightened creature in the room of accord, and that everyone in the room could see it, and that this, precisely this, was the lesson the human girl had crossed 10,000 light years to teach. Not to make him suffer, not to destroy him, to show him and to show the 91 what fear looked like when it finally, after 11,000 years, changed direction and flowed uphill. "Stand them down," he said to the guardians. His voice was barely a whisper. "Stand them down." The guardians withdrew, and Rell Cavanaugh, alone at the center of the floor, water still dripping from her plain dark clothes, did not gloat and did not smile, and did not press the advantage the way a conqueror would have, because she had not come to conquer. She had come to teach a class, and the class was nearly over, and there was only the last lesson left, the hardest one, the one her mother had given her on the 11th day. "Now," she said quietly, into the ringing silence of the room where the machine had died, "now that you're finally afraid, minister, let me show you what my people do with that, because being afraid is the beginning. It's what you do next that decides what kind of thing you are." What Rell Cavanaugh did next was the thing the Council would never fully understand, and it was the thing that made humanity's name a quiet legend in the tiers of 91 worlds for the rest of the Concordat's long life. She did not press the advantage. She had the room. Every delegate in the tiers had seen the master of fear reach for a weapon and then lower it, had seen the machine die in the walls, had seen their own kind stand up for the first time in centuries. The whole edifice was cracked, and a single hard push in that moment would have brought it down, and the human girl at the center of the floor knew it, and everyone watching knew that she knew it, and she did not push. Instead, she turned in a slow circle, taking in the standing delegates, the seated ones, the whole trembling assembly, and she spoke to all of them, and her voice was no longer the flat calm of the negotiation. It had warmth in it now, the warmth of a person who has finished the hard part of a hard thing and can finally say what she actually came to say. "I need you to hear the rest," she said, "or this all goes wrong and everything my people planned for turns into the worst mistake we ever made. So listen, all of you, especially the ones still sitting down." She let the room settle. "You're afraid of him," she said, and nodded up toward Vale Toon, small and gray and still at the top of the tiers. "You've been afraid of him your whole lives. And right now, for the first time, some of you are starting to think that the fear could run the other way, that there are 91 of you and one council, that you outnumber the room. And you're right, you do." She paused. "And that is the most dangerous moment your galaxy has ever been in. Because the easiest thing in the universe, the very easiest thing, is to take the fear you've been carrying and turn it around and point it back at the ones who made you carry it. We've done it. My species has done it more times than I can tell you without being ashamed. Every empire that ever burned out that way. The slaves become the masters and the masters become the slaves, and the ledger just changes hands and the room keeps standing, with a new face at the top of the table, and everyone tells themselves it's different this time. It is never different. The room is the problem, not the person sitting in it." The loom delegate, still standing, said quietly, "Then what would you have us do? You have shown us that we do not have to kneel. Do you now tell us we must not rise?" "I'm telling you there's a third thing," said Rell Cavanaugh. "There's always a third thing. My people didn't fight the Council's fleets because we'd lose, and we didn't sign the Council's terms because we'd die slower. We did the third thing. And the third thing, the thing my mother taught me on the 11th day, is the hardest thing there is, and it's the only thing that ever actually breaks the room instead of just changing who's inside it." She looked up at Vale Toon and her voice gentled. You stop being afraid and then you don't take your turn. You put the weapon down. You had the room and the whole galaxy watching and you chose not to make anyone kneel. That's the lesson. That's the whole lesson. Fear faced becomes courage. And courage, if you're not careful, becomes cruelty, becomes a new master with a new ledger. But courage that refuses to become cruelty, courage that walks all the way through the fear and comes out the other side and then chooses mercy anyway. That's the thing your galaxy has never seen, because he never let you see it. That's what my mother did. She was going to die and she used her last 11 days to make me less afraid instead of more. That's the strongest thing a living creature can do, and it is the opposite of everything this council ever taught you. And I am standing here soaking wet in your worst room to tell you that it is real, and that it is possible, and that you are all capable of it, because you are exactly as strong as we are, and you always were, and he needed you never to find out. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before it. It was not the silence of dread, nor of shock, nor of awe. It was the silence of a great many beings thinking, all at once, a thought they had never been permitted to think, and finding that the thought did not destroy them. Rell spoke. His voice, when it came, was so quiet that the chamber had to strain to carry it. "Why," he said, "you have won. You had only to keep talking and my council would have fallen tonight. Why do you turn now and hand these peoples the means to spare it? You owe us nothing. We would have killed you." Rell Cavanaugh looked up at him for a long moment. "Because I've seen what a galaxy looks like when the fear finally turns around," she said. "I've read the histories. 91 species with 11,000 years of grievance and nobody left to keep the peace, all of them freshly certain that the ones on top deserve whatever the ones on the bottom decide to do to them. That's not freedom, Minister. That's meridian. That's 11 days of everyone knowing exactly how it ends and having time to think about it. I grew up in that. I'm not going to be the one who does it to the whole galaxy just to win an argument in a room." She shook her head slowly. "My people didn't send me here to bring down the council. Anyone can bring down a council. My people sent me here to bring down the room, and you can't do that by putting a human at the top of it. You do it by teaching everyone in it that the top was always a lie." And she turned one last time to the 91, and she gave them the terms, the real terms, the ones humanity had spent 9 years and a volunteered heart condition, and the nerve of a 24-year-old attaché to place before the galaxy. "Here's what we want," she said. "Humanity joins your concordat, not as a subject, not as a master, as one more seat at a table that doesn't have a top anymore. The compliance ministry ends. The deep room goes dark. The screening of children stops everywhere on every world forever. And every species in these tiers gets the one thing the council took from you the day you signed, which is the right to be afraid in your own way and to decide for yourselves what to do with it. That's all. That's everything. That's the whole of what my species crossed 10,000 light years to ask for, and we asked for it for you as much as for us. Because a galaxy that runs on fear is a galaxy that will eventually do to some other small blue world exactly what this council tried to do to mine. And my mother did not sing me to sleep in a dying colony so that I could grow up and let that happen to somebody else's daughter. It should not have worked. By every law of the ledger, by every curve in the 600-year study of dread, it should not have worked. A single unarmed human, alone, 10,000 light-years from home, had no power to reorder a galaxy. But she had never been trying to use power. That was the thing Rell understood last, and understanding it was the closest thing to awe that his long gray life had ever held. She had been using truth, and truth in a room full of beings who had just remembered how to stand is a force that no ledger has a column for. One by one, and then in tens, and then in whole tiers, the delegates of the 91 rose in their places, not in rebellion, not in fury, but in assent, in the plain and terrible dignity of creatures choosing something for the first time in 11,000 years, and the room of accord filled with the sound of a galaxy standing up. Vale Toon did not order them down. He knew, with the clean, cold certainty of a scholar who has finally seen the whole of his subject, that there was no order left in the universe that would make them sit. And more than that, some ancient buried part of him, the part that had first been drawn to fear out of fascination and not out of hunger, the part that had wanted once long ago, before the ledger closed over it simply to understand, was standing up too, somewhere far down inside him where no one could see. The ministry, he said, and his voice cracked on the word, has kept the peace for 11,000 years. You would trade that peace for the freedom to be afraid. You do not know what you are unleashing. Neither do they. No, Rell Cavanaugh agreed. We don't. That's what freedom is. You've had 11,000 years of knowing exactly what came next. Look what it cost you. She gestured at the standing tiers, at the dead machine, at the small chair on the exposed floor. We'll take the not knowing. My people always have. We're good at it. We'll teach you if you let us. It turns out we're better teachers than we ever were students, and the galaxy never even found out because you were so sure you already understood the only thing worth understanding. It was not, in the end, a surrender. That was what the historians could never quite capture, in all the accounts they wrote afterward, in all the 91 languages that carried the story home. The council was not overthrown. Vale Toon was not deposed, not killed, not dragged from his high seat. The thing that happened in the room of accord was stranger and quieter, and more complete than any of that. An empire built entirely on a single premise simply discovered, in the space of one afternoon in front of everyone, that the premise had never been true, and an empire that discovers the foundation was always a lie does not need to be pushed. It needs only to be shown, and then it comes down on its own slowly, with a kind of grace, like a held breath finally released. They signed a new accord that night. It was very short. It had no articles of surrender, no compliance officer, no forfeitures. It had 92 names on it, and the 92nd was written in a small, plain human hand, and it belonged to a second attaché who had, that morning, held no authority worth the name. Ambassador Osai woke 11 days later as it happened, exactly 11, and when they told her what her young aide had done in the chamber while she slept, the old woman laughed until she wept, and then she asked to be taken to see the deep room, which by then stood open and dark and empty, its warm medium drained, its door propped wide so that anyone who wished could walk in and see that it was only a room after all. She stood in the doorway of the thing that had broken the bravest minds in the galaxy for 11,000 years, and she said, to no one in particular, we told her not to volunteer. We told her she was too young, and then, after a while, we were wrong about which part mattered. Rell Cavanaugh went home eventually, to a world with a sky that human hands had made blue, though not the one she was born under. Meridian was a memorial now, a quiet, airless world kept exactly as it had been, where the gardens the dying had planted still stood preserved under the stars, dry and perfect and never bloomed. She was not made a hero, because humanity, for all its faults, had learned to be careful with its heroes. She went back to work. She was a first attaché now, and then, in time, an ambassador, and she was good at it. And she never once told the story of what she had done in the room of accord, because she did not think of it as a thing she had done. She thought of it as a thing her mother had done, on the 11th day in the last message, and everything after was only the long echo of it, traveling outward through the dark, arriving at last in a gray room 10,000 light-years away, on time. As for Vale Toon, he lived a long while yet, as the Threndari reckon it, and he spent those years doing the only thing he had ever truly loved, which was the study of fear. But he studied the other half of it now, the half he had spent 600 years making sure no one would ever see, and the papers he wrote in those final centuries were unlike anything the Ministry archives had ever held, because they were written by a being who had once, late and only once, been afraid in the open in front of everyone, and had lowered his hand, and had not taken his turn. He was buried, when he died, with a single line requested for the marker, and it was not in the language of the ledger, and it was not a boast, and the young of the Threndari puzzled over it for generations, because it seemed to say the opposite of everything their people had once believed. It said, "I thought I understood fear." That was all. The rest he had learned too late to write down, and did not need to, because by then the whole galaxy already knew it. The Galactic Council had ruled 11,000 years in the certainty that it alone spoke the language of fear. That fear was a leash and a ledger and a tool of control, that every living thing could be steered by the threat of the terrible. And then a soaking wet human girl of 24 had walked out of its worst room with a story about her mother, and had shown 91 trembling peoples that fear was never a leash at all, but the raw material of the bravest thing a creature can become, and that the only ones who ever truly understood it were the ones who had stopped running, turned around in the dark, and walked all the way in.